Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Real Talk, IQRA TV's flagship current affairs show with Dilly Hussain, where we will be discussing the hottest topics affecting the Muslim community. In today's program, we'll be looking at how the war in Syria has impacted British Muslims. And with us today in the studio, we have Shiraz Maher from the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College, and Ibtihal Bsis, a barrister specialising on prevent cases. And later on in the show, we will be joined by Majid Freeman, a prominent aid worker. Before we start, I'd like to remind all the viewers you can tweet us your thoughts at IQRA TV, #RealTalk, and please do feel free to phone in on the number stated below. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for coming on. Shiraz, I want to start with you. We're entering the 5th year of the war in Syria, and what it appears to me and many is that it's quite different to wars in the past. We've had the first Gulf War, we had the Afghan-Soviet war, we had the war in Bosnia, we had the Libyan revolution. What makes the war in Syria different to all those that I've just mentioned?
I think when we look at the Syrian conflict, it's been through a number of different phases and evolutions since the start of the uprising. So what started off as a peaceful, legitimate, popular uprising against the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad then became an armed resistance, principally led by military defectors, the so-called Free Syrian Army. And it was really unusual in those early stages to find individuals from the community fighting against the regime, but you had the defectors who were giving protection to protesters, particularly in areas like Homs and Baba Amr, for example, and so on, and in the south in Dara. Then, as time evolved, individuals began to fight, and you began to see the sort of, I suppose, emergence of different jihadi groups from different aspects of the spectrum. So groups like Ahrar al-Sham at one end, all the way through, of course, to ISIS at the extreme other end of that spectrum. And then you saw another phase or development, which was the influx of foreign fighters going over who were participating at that stage, again, earlier on, if we look at 2012, 2013, they were going across the spectrum of different groups. It wasn't that one group had a monopoly. And it seems now that really, unfortunately, in the minds of many people, this has become a two-way battle between Bashar al-Assad on one hand and Islamic State on the other. And the great tragedy of that is that for all these people in the middle who don't belong to either of these two things, their revolution, their sacrifice is lost. So I think that's, what we see is different, is the involvement of external actors on all sides and a lot of fingers in the Syrian pie, the foreign fighters.
Would it be correct to say that the wars that I've just mentioned to you, they also had external players? I mean, in the Afghan-Soviet war, we had America and the CIA train up Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen. In Libya, we had the NATO intervention. So Syria isn't that different in terms of intervention, interference from external powers. Again, I guess what I'm trying to reach at is there seems to be a certain religious fever to the Syrian war.
Oh, absolutely, there is. But I would push back on one front, is that in the Afghan campaign, for example, in the 1980s against the Soviet Union, it's a matter of scale. That there were a few thousand Arab fighters who had gone out there to participate. The scale, the sheer scale of what you're seeing right now in Syria in terms of mobilization is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like that in anywhere, Libya or elsewhere. But there's no doubt that, we were discussing this before the show actually started, was that at the start of the uprising, a religious terminology began to come into the conflict, and that was because what Bashar al-Assad wanted to do at the very early stages was to make this a sectarian conflict, and was to say that, look, here is a bunch of people who are extremists, who are Wahhabis, who have brought ideas that are alien to the Syrian nation, alien to the Syrian people, and they're essentially, this represents the protest movement. The problem was when he did that, was that the level of insult that was aimed and directed against normative Islam. So anyone who is a Muslim, not saying someone who even is a conservative or orthodox, but anyone who's a Muslim, who would look at what was being said by the regime soldiers in those days, by hasb-e-haal and so on, when they were really torturing the hell out of people, you can't help but be moved, because it was so disgusting, it was so sectarian, it was so, taking words of the Quran and changing them to glorify Bashar al-Assad instead of Allah, insulting Sahabi and so on, that inevitably produced a backlash, and that produced a very strong pushback against the regime, so that now we have this very religiously infused conflict. And I think that's, again, it's part of the tragedy of what's taken place in Syria.
I think there is a big difference between the conflicts that have happened in Afghanistan. Certainly the revolutions we've seen in Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia. Syria is slightly different. And I'm going to quote an Egyptian journalist who lived in Afghanistan for a number of years. And he was there throughout the American intervention, shall we call. And he actually said, if you don't understand the international arena, if you don't understand regimes and states, if you don't understand where the world power is, then you are giving up your blood for nothing. And effectively, we've seen that a number of regimes, such as in Libya, which is a complete mess now, I'm actually Libyan.
Okay.
So when the revolution started, it did start to take on a religious flavour. But then what happened was...
Were you initially excited when the Libyan revolution began?
I was hopeful.
You're hopeful?
I was hopeful. I wouldn't say I was excited. I was hopeful for the people because I know that their Islam had been removed from them for a number of years. And they'd had a brutal leader for 40 years. That's why I came to Britain as a political refugee.
So at what point did your hope change?
When I saw David Cameron enter with Nikolai Sarkozy and say, we are your friends. And at that moment, all hope went. And I knew that Libya would be split because it's oil rich. It has gold. They found gold in the Sahara Desert. But Syria is not having any of this. Syria is much more conscious. Syria is much more aware. I mean, I spoke to women that used to be illiterate on the fields, and they could give you a political analysis of what America was up to. So they were not having Hillary Clinton's coalitions. They were not having the coalition that she brought about, the Syrian National Council. They were not having John Kerry's Geneva 1, 2, and 3, Kofi Annan's 6-point plan, I think it was. They were just not having it. They didn't want interference. And I think that's why we're here. Because America wants to control the revolution and Syria will not allow it to. So now we're at a stage where this situation is so complicated that it's very difficult to take it apart. And now, of course, we've got everybody invading Syria, including the Russians.
Shiraz, specifically looking at British Muslims and the British Muslim community, for a good 4 years now, we've seen a lot of activism, an increase in aid and charity work, and also comes with it Britain's going off to fight in Syria. Would you say from your field of study that the Syrian war, I mean, what is the actual figure? I mean, I've heard 500 have left to fight, 700, some are saying 1,000. Do you have a rough idea what the actual accurate number is?
It's a real stab in the dark. The centre where I work at King's has attempted to produce figures. I've not personally worked on that side of things. You know, and it's an imprecise science. We did last time was in January, where we said it was about 500 to 600. But to be honest, you know, I'm always constantly saying maybe the figure's too high or it's too low in some circumstances. And the reason I say that is because, for example, a number of families have contacted us whose children have gone out to Syria. Maybe sometimes in certain cases we knew of the individual, in other cases we didn't. But what's dawned on me is when I'm talking to the family or we're getting details from them, they're also mentioning, oh, you know, he went with 3 or 4 other people. So even if we knew about the one, sometimes you're thinking that the scale factor could be much higher. But if I'm honest, no one really knows and no one has a sense of it. I don't even think the intelligence agencies, with all their sophistication, know. So I'm always reluctant. And there's a very good scholar in Norway called Thomas Hegghammer, who works a lot on these issues, and he gave a quote to the BBC recently where he said, it's not obviously many, I don't expect any viewers really eat sausages, but he said, you know, he quoted a butcher, and he said, a butcher knows what goes into it, so they don't eat sausages. And he said, I think the same thing about numbers for foreign fighters who go to Syria. Because I'm a political scientist who works on this, I don't trust the figures. Okay.
Do you feel sometimes the numbers boosted up to fulfill a certain agenda or security agenda? We've seen this from the right-wing press, we've seen this by certain security officials. Whilst you say that even the security service may not have an accurate understanding of the numbers, do you feel that sometimes the number is hyped up?
Well, I think people have tried to hype up the number, and people have tried to use the Syria conflict, as you say, individuals who've gone off to fight, for all kinds of political ends, you know, good and bad. And so the reality is, it's clear that several hundred people from this country have gone out there. That's undeniable. But it's also clear a lot of them came back, because in the early stages, again, when I talk about 2013 in particular, individuals were going for short periods of time and then they would return to this country. So the figures that you're getting are cumulative. It's not that this is how many people are there right now who are on the it's cumulative. It includes people who have died, who've come back, who are sort of probably in Turkey in limbo and so on.
Out of that rough number, which no one's really aware of, how many of them do you think are with ISIS or with other rebel factions? Because what we hear is 500-600 have gone to join the Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State. But what we do know also is that not all of them have gone to join ISIS.
So I think that's a media laziness, it's misrepresentation. Because you say, okay, 500-600 have gone to fight in Syria. And what people hear is 500-600 have gone to join ISIS, because they don't distinguish. And of course you have to bear in mind, for a Muslim community, when they hear these different names, they have even a basic understanding of Arabic, they know there's different groups. For the average Joe Bloggs on the street, it just seems like they don't know what's happening, it's an alphabet soup. So they easily equate anyone who goes Syria to this. From my own analysis of it, I believe that people who went in the earlier phases, again 2012, 2013, and to an extent in the early part of 2014, were not necessarily going to join ISIS, but some were. Others were just joining other groups. It was about where you could get access and who was prepared to take you in. And as I say, if you look at the clusters of individuals from West London in particular, sort of more of the guys from Arab backgrounds, not South Asian backgrounds, then they were not at all with ISIS, but had gone to join groups like Jund al-Aqsa, Jaish al-Muhajirin, and so on. And so then you've seen over time different things happen. As I say, it's very easy to join ISIS. People now who go clearly do attempt to go to ISIS because it claims to have established a khilafah, and that's an appeal in and of itself to certain people. But one of the other final points I'd make is that you've also seen over time people defect within the Syrian context. So individuals who started out with some of these groups have later on then been attracted to ISIS and have gone over to it. And there's a very good example of a Dutch foreign fighter who's probably well known to you as well, a guy called Yilmaz.
Yes, Yilmaz.
And he was very anti-ISIS and is now, of course, a member of it.
Ibtihal, when you were in Syria and you spoke to the people there, what was their views towards an Islamic State or a khilafah or having an Islamic government post-Bashar, if that was ever to be the case? Did you feel there was a positive sentiment there?
Well, I think Brother Shiraz made some important points about the beginning of the revolution. It was a peaceful revolution. Then 8 months down the line, there were people that defected and they needed arming because people would come out in the street and say, hurriya, freedom, and he would kill them with warplanes and machine guns and the worst killings. So people did defect and it became a struggle, an armed struggle amongst those that defected. But what had happened, if you look at the Jum'ah demonstrations from 2011 down to 2000, around the middle of 2013, before we saw ISIS appear, it did become more Islamic as it came down. So at the beginning they were saying the Jum'ah of Western intervention, the Jum'ah of Kofi Annan, you're killing us, the Jum'ah of the Arab League, you're killing us, the Jum'ah of freedom. Then it became eventually the Jum'ah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. They used to say things like, he is our leader forever, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So it became more and more Islamic. When I was out there, I saw number plates which had the word Khilafah written on them, and the Raya flag became much more evident.
They weren't ISIS-held areas, were they?
Sorry?
They weren't ISIS-held areas,
No. This is before ISIS came along. But I did see, I'd started to see ISIS around the summer of 2013. We were very concerned because we knew that this was trouble brewing. But the people in those areas got rid of them. And nobody supported ISIS, no one wanted to see them. I mean, all of us here don't support them, but effectively I knew that there was trouble brewing. But the headquarters were quite large in some areas, like in Kafr Takharim, which is right next to, which is in Idlib, and you could literally just drone attack them and remove them. I'm not suggesting that that's what should have happened, but they were evident. And they raised more questions than answers, actually, because even the Parliamentary Commission in Iraq, when they were in Mosul, found that Noor al-Maliki was responsible for allowing them to grow because they were in Mosul. They took $4 billion from the bank accounts there. They took military armor that belonged to 3 different battalions. They're large battalions, and they were basically allowed to sort of grow. And when they came to Syria, it just raised the question in my mind. If they could get rid of Saddam Hussein and his military, which was a very mighty military, in less than a month.
Quickly to wrap up.
Why couldn't they get rid of ISIS in less than a week?
Valid point.
Their military might is nothing compared to the Iraqi military. Why hasn't ISIS, if people unarmed in places like Kafat Kharin can remove them in 2 days,
Okay.
I don't understand why America can't remove them in less than a week. I think they raise more questions than answers, actually, ISIS.
Well, that is for the first part of the show. When we return after the Maghrib break, we'll be looking at how the war in Syria has influenced anti-terror laws and some policies that are being pushed by the British government. Please join us after the break on IQRA TV.